My name is Emma Tobias, and I love Jane Austen. Saying you love Jane Austen in 2020 is like saying that you love sunflowers and a light drizzle of rain against your window and hot beverages. It's very basic, but it's comforting and important nonetheless. I want to talk about Jane Austen adaptations because that is where my brain is at. My brain is in the world of costume dramas, of Regency-era dresses and cravats, of people dancing, that like hand gestury way that they used to dance. That's where I am, emotionally. This is not an all-encompassing list of my favorite Austen adaptations. I'm going to leave some out, and I will not be discussing any adaptations of Persuasion, because honestly I've never seen an adaptation of Persuasion, and I could have rectified this for this video, but I didn't. The first adaptation that I want to talk about is the 1998 version of
Mansfield Park,
starring Frances O'Connor as Fanny Price, and starring our boy Johnny Lee Miller, king of Austen adaptations, as Edmund Bertram. Now, Mansfield Park is a much maligned Austen novel. Most people think it's quite boring, and I don't blame them. Not a ton happens in this story. It's really just about a girl who deals with a lot of crappy people, arguably gets involved with one of the weakest Austen heroes in Edmund Bertram. Despite everything I've just said, I think Mansfield Park is really interesting, and I think this adaptation elevates all the best parts of the original novel, which in my opinion is Fanny Price and her strict sense of moralism, which sounds quite boring, but I think is actually very fascinating. Fanny Price is a character who lives and breathes by her idea of what is right and what is wrong, despite the fact that by being opinionated, by showcasing that moralism, especially when others don't agree with her, could send her back to poverty, which is something this adaptation actually showcases in a really honest and brutal way. When she decides she does not want to marry Henry Crawford,
I cannot agree to marry him at this time. Do not trust him, sir.
What do you distrust?
His nature, sir. Like many charming people, he conceals an almost absolute dependence on the appreciation of others.
Because she doesn't feel it is right and she doesn't want to, Sir Bertram gets so angry that he sends her back into poverty, literally, into her original childhood home with her family.
Perhaps you would rather return to Portsmouth. I can write to your mother tonight. A little abstinence from the luxuries and elegancies of Mansfield Park.
Now, you also see Fanny as someone who's incredibly loyal. At the beginning of the movie, you see her as a sort of Jo March character, writing stories to send to her younger sister. I love this because it shows that, yeah, she's being sent back into the situation, but she's going to make the best of it, and she's happy to see her family. But it puts her in a worse position because her loyalty truly lies, at least in Mansfield Park, to Edmund Bertram, someone who for most of the story is her moral equal.
Lovers' vows. I'm convinced that our father would disapprove.
And when he isn't her moral equal is when he gets wrapped up in the Crawford's sex appeal.
Someone among you am I to have the pleasure of making love to?
On reconsideration, I cannot help but think that, well, despite the displeasure of appearing inconsistent, it would be better for me to play Anne Holt.
This is something that causes strife between the two of them and eventually leads them to have a falling out and Edmund to not take Fanny's side, especially when it comes to the engagement with her and Henry Crawford.
He could make you very happy, and you would be the making of him.
And this is also what leads him back to her, and something you see at the end of the adaptation.
I'm so anxious to do what is right that I forgot to do what is right.
Now, there are a couple instances where I think that her moralism comes through in a really stark way, and this adaptation really showcases the darker side of the Regency era, and it shows how Fanny and her moralism has a part to play. One particular moment involves the way the Bertrams make their money. You see that Sir Bertram makes his money through plantations and on the backs of slaves. She's not educated in this way, so she decides to educate herself. She goes into Sir Bertram's library, finds a book of sketches that showcases the atrocities that are committed onto the slaves by the plantation owners like Sir Bertram. She is absolutely horrified, and you see her disgusted by this. Fanny's put into a situation where she finds out how Mansfield Park even exists. and it's on the back of slaves. I appreciate this because you don't see a lot of Austen adaptations or really historical dramas in general set in the UK where you see how these upper class people have made their money. Overall, I think that this adaptation is darker than most Austen adaptations by showcasing the stark difference between the way that the Bertrams and the Crawfords are living their life, playing around at Mansfield Park, and also showcasing how they are making their money, and having Fanny be in the middle of both has her be this moral compass in this story. And it's something that I really, 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 really find interesting. I really like this adaptation. I think overall it is not the easiest to get through, but the book isn't the easiest to get through. And beyond that, it's still a sweet story. It's very well acted, and I love the scenery and the music. And it's on Netflix, so give it a watch. Let's talk about the behemoth that is Pride and Prejudice. I'm only going to talk about 2 adaptations. I have a lot of favorites. I love Pride and Prejudice. I love Bridget Jones' Diary. I love the 1995 Pride and Prejudice. But I'm going to focus on 2 that I feel like I have stuff to say about. The first is the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, which is a web series from 2013 created by Hank Green and Bernie Sue that was over the course of about a year and cross-platform experience where the characters interacted on Twitter and Instagram and Tumblr in real time. This is something that was really fun to watch while it was happening. I started watching it very early on in the beginning of the show and went through the entire experience. It was fun to talk about on Tumblr, and it was fun to see how the characters developed. This adaptation has Elizabeth Bennet, Lizzie Bennet, as a graduate student who is working with her best friend Charlotte Lucas to create a web series for their new media studies master's degree.
Who am I? I'm a 24-year-old grad student with a mountain of student loans, living at home and preparing for a career.
She is quite hapless in her life, and she feels like a really great modern millennial Elizabeth Bennet. Now, this adaptation also pares down the characters a bit, especially in the Bennet family. For example, you never see the Bennet parents, but you hear them talked about, and then you have less sisters. So there's Jane Bennet, who is very much Jane Bennet.
Okay. Alright, bye. Oh my gosh, I almost forgot. I fixed this for you during break, so be careful next time with those buttons, but, you know, I'll fix that.
And then you have Lydia Bennet.
What? No. What?
Mr. Darcy is a tech bro, and Bingley is Asian American, and the Bingleys in general are Asian American. Nice to see some diversity in a modern adaptation of Austen. This is a really, overall, a great adaptation. It showcases the way technology would make Pride and Prejudice a different story, and I think is a little more hyperbolic in its depiction of the main characters. For example, Lizzie Bennet is quite annoying. She's incredibly self-righteous, she's incredibly prideful, she is really judgmental, and you see this because this story, this adaptation, is almost exclusively told from her perspective. Even when she recreates what is happening off camera, she does so with role plays with the other people in her family, through props and costumes.
As you say, my dear, he's a well-mannered young man from Harvard working to become a doctor. I hear his family has quite the fortune.
So everything is coming from her voice. Of course, that's challenged by her sisters, it's challenged by the fact that you have that cross-platform aspect, and it's challenged when a few times throughout the web series other characters will take over the camera. And even when Lydia Bennet has her own little side channel, the Lydia Bennet Diaries, where you see what's going on with her.
This phone is my only connection to the outside world. If you're receiving this communication, I may already be dead. Of boredom.
Now, I think Jane Bennet is pretty much pitch perfect Jane Bennet. She's not very hyperbolic. She's exactly who she is in the novel. But really where you see this is in Lydia Bennet's character, which I think she has the strongest plotline, and it's the best version, I think, of Lydia Bennet that gives her the most amount of kindness and due. In almost every adaptation has sort of a unredeemable arc. She's flighty, she's annoying, no one really likes her except for Kitty Bennet, and when she runs off with Wickham, she's quite smug when she comes back from being saved by Mr. Darcy. Yes, it's sad that Mr. Wickham is a total jerk, but she in herself is very prideful and feels like she has won over her sisters. Now in this adaptation, you actually like Lydia Bennet from the start. She's a party girl and she's wild and she's brass, but you kind of get why someone would want to be friends with her. She'd be a fun person to go drinking with.
Hey everybody! Now I know what you're thinking. Hey Lydia, where's your much older, much more depressing sister Lizzie?
Instead of her running off with Wickham to get married and having her reputation ruined, something that is difficult to do in terms of a 2013 setting, she instead is victim of revenge porn. And Mr. Wickham is posting revenge porn onto a website with a countdown. And because Darcy is a tech bro, he's able to rectify the situation and get the site down. And you see Lydia completely traumatized by this experience. And her sisters really come together, and they come together to make her feel better, to work through her trauma. I really appreciated that Lydia gets her due, and you see her getting closer with her sisters instead of moving further apart from them. Overall, I love this adaptation. If you have a lot of time on your hands, I would give it a watch. It's all on YouTube, and it's a lot of fun. Now, as you might have guessed, the other adaptation that I want to talk about of Pride and Prejudice is the 2005 Pride and Prejudice starring Keira Knightley and Matthew McFadden, directed by Joe Wright. Everyone loves this adaptation, and for good reason. It's great. And the only thing I really want to talk about in terms of this adaptation is how gentle it is. It is literally gentle in the way that it's filmed, in the scenery, in the soft yellowish, bluish color palette that you see. It has a very similar vibe as the New Little Women in terms, I feel like, of the colors that you see throughout it, but also in its music and its acting, which is what I want to focus in on. While this Lizzie Bennet is high-tempered and independent and loud at times, I feel like she's also the most gentle Elizabeth Bennet. You see her gentleness in her interactions with her sisters, and not just with Jane. You see it in the way that she comforts her mother at the end of the movie when her younger sister, Kitty, has run off. You see it in how she reacts to Kitty's marriage and how sad she is for Kitty. She's angry, but she's also sad that her sister has done this and kind of ruined her life and made her life much sadder than it needed to be. It's why her and Darcy end up connecting, because Darcy is also hot-tempered and at times cold, but he has just as much gentleness for his family, and you see it with his younger sister, but also in the way that he's friends with Mr. Bingley. You see it in that funny moment when Mr. Bingley wants to propose to Jane, and he's really nervous, and Darcy is there for him in a playful sort of way, and I feel like in the end they fall in love because of their loyalty to their family, and also their gentleness. Let's move on to Emma. Emma is my favorite Jane Austen book, so it makes sense that I love almost every adaptation. I love the Kate Beckinsale Emma, which is the first Austen adaptation I ever saw in 2003. I love the 2009 miniseries with our boy Johnny Lee Miller playing Mr. Knightley. I love Clueless. There's really not an Emma adaptation I don't love. I will say that I've never seen the Gwyneth Paltrow version because I don't like Gwyneth Paltrow. But I want to focus in on Emma 2020. And if you want to see a really good video about this, watch Lena Norm's video where she compares the 1996 version and the 2020 version. I really love that video. I adored this movie. I watched it a few days ago and I really can't stop thinking about it. I love the music. I love the way that it was filmed. I love how stark it is. But what I love most is that you see the emotional vulnerability of Emma and Mr. Knightley more than in any other adaptation. Emma does start off as probably the meanest Emma ever on screen. Emma becomes kinder very slowly, and in the moment that I love most in this film, when she is confronted by Mr. Knightley after saying something nasty to Mrs. Bates, she is completely stricken with guilt and how mad she is at herself. At first she's reluctant to admit it, but then she eventually realizes, no, she's screwed up. And I love that emotional growth. And I love Mr. Knightley's softness in this film. He's a very emotional boy, and he's very much in his feels, and it was great. I loved it. Also, I love that they're age appropriate. I think that's so nice. This coffee's getting cold. The next adaptation I want to talk about is Northanger Abbey, and specifically the 2007 version starring Felicity Jones as Catherine Morland, and J.J. Field as my favorite boy, Henry Tilney. Northanger Abbey is both a parody of the Gothic sensational novel, like an Anne Radcliffe story, and also a praise of the novel itself, which is a difficult thing to, I think, do well, and I think this adaptation does it well. Now, going back to what I said about Catherine Morland, you see her very early on is incredibly naive when she's starting her life in Bath in a city, but also you see her wit and her interactions with the Tilneys, both Henry and his younger sister. I love an interaction early on where Henry and Catherine are dancing at a ball, and I think Henry expects her to be just a naive young girl with no brains, but they actually have some intellectual sparring, and it surprises him.
Forgive me, I have been very remiss in the proper attentions of a partner.
What are they?
Oh, I ask you how long you've been in Bath. Have you been to the theatre, and concert, and so on?
Wouldn't that be rather dull?
I think much like Fanny Price, Catherine Morland is an incredibly loyal person and also a very moral person. She has a lot of loyalty to the Tilneys, and her loyalty only really wavers when she's being manipulated by the Thorpes, but you also see it when Catherine Morland has started to make up stories in her head when she's at Northanger Abbey about what happened to the Tilneys' mother, and the Tilneys express, especially Henry, how hurt they are by all of this dramatization.
I understand you rightly. You have been suspecting my father of a crime so dreadful.
You said yourself the house was full of secrets.
And so you decided that my father must be a murderer.
She also rectifies this because she isn't an idiot, and also because she has a lot of loyalty to the Tilneys.
I'm so ashamed of what I said.
I also could draw a lot of parallels between Henry Tilney and Catherine Morland and Emma Woodhouse and Mr. Knightley, and the fact that the hero is sort of pushing the heroine to be a better person or be a more aware person. I really enjoy this adaptation. I think it's really well acted, and I think Felicity Jones does a great job of having that sort of naive personality and also having that intellectual prowess that I think Catherine has underneath it all. Plus Henry Tilney is such a sweetie. Finally, let's talk about Sense and Sensibility. Sense and Sensibility has two really great adaptations. There's a miniseries that's a lot of fun, and then there's the 1990s version that Emma Thompson wrote that has a complete all-star cast. I'm going to talk about that version. I love this version because you have Emma Thompson as Eleanor, who's one of my favorite Jane Austen characters, who in my opinion is just Jane Bennet if Jane Bennet was the star of the show. And then you have Marianne Dashwood, who's played by Kate Winslet and has an iconic scene where she's standing in the rain, and it's absolutely lovely, and I painted it one time. You have Hugh Grant as Edward Ferrars, Alan Rickman as Colonel Brandon. It is an all-star cast. I love this adaptation. It's really funny, it's really smart, it's fast-paced, it's highly entertaining. My one qualm with all Sense and Sensibility versions is that Colonel Brandon in the book is supposed to be 35 years old, and yet he's played by men in their 50s, and I'm tired of it, because it's weird and creepy and very hard for me to be invested in that story. I don't have a lot to say about this adaptation other than that thing about Colonel Brandon, but I do really enjoy it, and I love how 90s it feels, and how fun it is, and how much you get to see Emma Thompson, like, brood, and I just love that. As I talked about at the beginning of this video, I really love Persuasion. I love the book, but I've never seen an adaptation. I don't know of any good ones. I know that there's one with that woman who's in The Shape of Water and who's in Paddington, whose name is escaping me, but I've never been, like, interested in watching that version. So if there's one that you really like, I would love a recommendation. I'd also love to know what you think of any of these adaptations, what your favorite Austen adaptation is. That would be awesome. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Have a lovely day.